Good morning,
Okay,
and good afternoon for you, Toby. How are you?
I'm doing really well. It's lovely to see you. Thanks for inviting me along.
All right. Well, you're welcome. More than welcome. Let's see where this conversation takes us, because it can be confrontational. It can be well, it can go any way, really. Let's first talk, because I know you a little bit, because I've done a bit of research, and we've talked before the show. And just to tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you from? Where are you now, if that's any different? And a little bit about the background of yourself, and what is yours. And I always call that the cultural frame of reference. In other words, what is your experience with different cultures?
Sure. So I live in the UK. I was born here. I'm still living here in the UK. Um, I live in the north of the UK, but I was actually born in the southwest. But I've spent almost 20 years in London, working for various companies. I'm a diversity and inclusion consultant. So I work with heads of HR to help them create their diversity and inclusion strategies. And actually, a lot of what I do also is working with senior leaders on their inclusive leadership skills and abilities. And one of the things that we talk about is their cultural competency as part of being an inclusive leader. Before I set up my own company, though, I worked for various companies, including Accenture, the BBC, and Deloitte. I had a background in technology initially, and then I ended up working in the field of diversity and inclusion at the BBC when I did a career switch.
All right, well, that's pretty good. So you're in the UK. Can you define, before we move any further? Can you define what diversity and inclusion means? I guess in your part of the world, because I guess in other parts of the world it could mean something different.
Yeah, it's a good question because I always say to my clients that actually diversity applies to all of us. We are all diverse in some way or another, and I think that sometimes there's a limited view on diversity that some leaders think that it begins and ends with a few groups of people, but we are all diverse. We all have different characteristics, different lived experiences that we can bring to the table.
Mhm.
Some of those might be visible. So, for example, if you met me in real life, you would see that I present as male, that I'm a white man, that I'm a wheelchair user because I've got a physical disability.
Mhm.
But there are also invisible characteristics or traits that we can't necessarily see. So that could be your sexuality. It could be if you are introverted or extroverted. For example, whether you grew up in the countryside or in the middle of a city. So first of all, when it comes to diversity, we are all diverse in some way or another. The question is, how inclusive are we of one another? Do we create an environment where you feel respected for who you are, where you feel like you belong to the workplace, where you feel empowered to do your best work, and that you're able to progress in your career?
Mhm. Okay. Do you think? Okay, you're. I think you're taking this from a UK perspective. I mean, that this would be, I guess, your relevant frame of reference. Do you think this is
Yeah.
differently interpreted? Say, let's talk some extremes here. The US versus China.
Yeah, I think it diversity can be slightly different depending on where you are in the world. So um, if we take the US, for example, we talk about um, race very differently in the US compared to the UK.
Yeah.
There's different language, there's a different history about racial inequality in the US compared to the UK or other parts of the world, like um, India, for example.
Yeah.
So you do have to, depending on where you are in the world, you do have to um, adapt the conversation accordingly.
Right. So it's again, as pretty much everything, at least that's my conviction. Nothing is culturally neutral, and even not diversity and inclusion.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I
I,
think
I
a lot of when we talk about diversity, actually, I like to talk to my clients about representation and whether or not an organization is representative of the community in which you are based in or that you serve.
Mm-hmm.
Even within the UK, the UK is a very diverse country,
Mm-hmm.
but demographics differ significantly. A business based in London has a very different demographic available to it than a business that's based in the middle of Scotland, for example.
Right.
So, you do have to look at the demographics around you.
Right. And with demographics, you mean the makeup of the organization, the people within the organization.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. All of the different traits. Yeah.
Right. I read in your LinkedIn profile that one word that triggered me is that you are or were a cultural architect. What does that mean? And what does somebody like a cultural architect do?
Yeah. I think you might have picked up on the inclusion architect rather than cultural architect.
I think it was pretty literal, cultural architect. Nonetheless, go ahead.
Yeah. So I often refer to myself as a diversity and inclusion architect. And the reason why I say that is because I work with organizations to help them architect or create their inclusion strategies.
Mm-hmm.
So I go into organizations and I kind of help them create the framework that they need to work within. And that's why I kind of go by inclusion architect.
Okay. All right. Okay. Well, that's a good explanation. I like the word architect in terms of creating and sort of drawing and then giving it and presenting it to your client. I understand
Exactly.
what makes
Yeah.
sense with that. Same
That's
because
what I mostly enjoy. Yeah.
yeah, I understand. So again, from your LinkedIn profile, because that gives me the most information. There's a phrase that says you talk about our society needs a software update for our language. What do you mean with that?
Yeah. Yeah. So language is constantly evolving.
Mm.
There are phrases or words or terminology that we use nowadays that have a very different meaning to the past. There are words or language that is offensive now that wouldn't have been offensive 30,
Example?
40, 50 years ago. Um, so woke, for example,
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of talk in organizations about being woke or wokenism.
Mm-hmm.
That's taken on a very different meaning. In some organizations, it's almost used as a bit of a weapon that somebody is quote unquote very woke. It's almost like political correctness has gone mad.
Mm-hmm.
That might have been a phrase that you hear here. Whereas the origins of the word woke is very interesting, and it's really about kind of somebody's cultural awareness and wanting to address inequalities within society. So, but unfortunately, um, particularly if we look at, say, some of the British press, and it's used by some politicians, for example, that it as a weapon. Um, so that's an example of how a bit of language has changed.
Mm-hmm.
If we look at disability, for example,
Mm-hmm.
um, in the past, disabled people could have been or would have been called handicapped in the UK. Handicapped is really not a word that we use anymore to describe somebody who's disabled.
Mm-hmm.
However, it is commonly used in the US, and it's not really seen as an insult in the US.
Right.
And it's interesting how the language differs across the ocean.
Yeah. Yeah, and it makes me what I do in preparation of this. I prep a few questions, and usually I leave them behind because I prefer to have the flow of the conversation. And what you just told me, what you just said, is it makes me think of the latest Ricky Gervais Armageddon show and the Dave Chappelle Dreamer show. What do you think? What do you think about that? One is American, one is British.
I haven't seen his show, so
You should
I can't
definitely
really comment on
check
them.
it out. Yeah.
I will
Yeah.
now. Yeah, I'll add it to my recommendations list.
Okay. Well. Okay. Well then, have you seen Dave Chappelle?
I haven't. No, no.
Okay. Well, because Dave Chappelle actually addresses disability people with a disability, and Ricky Gervais talks a lot about woke. So it's actually the two topics
Right.
that you
Okay.
just touched upon.
Okay.
I'm
In
going to
that
side.
case, I will definitely add it to my watch list.
Good, good. I'm going to sidetrack a bit here. This year, this in 2024, we're recording this, by the way, January 2024, for those who are listening in the future. This year in Paris, in France, there will be the Olympics, right? And there also will be the Paralympics. And I live in Paris, and I know the city pretty well. I don't think there's one metro station, which people use a lot to get around, that you can access in a wheelchair. I think it's impossible.
Mm.
What could be a solution to this? I mean, this is not inclusion at all.
No, it's not. And I've been to Paris a few times, and I have found navigating the city in my wheelchair quite difficult.
Mhm.
I haven't attempted to use the underground system, so I don't know how good or bad it is. But when I do compare Paris to other cities, if we compare it to London, where I lived for 20 years, every taxi in London is wheelchair accessible.
Yeah.
The traditional black cabs. The underground itself is not perfect. I think 30% of the underground system is step free up to the train. There was a slight improvement in the 2012 Paralympic Games in London, where there was a bit of investment in public transport at that time, but still, it's not terribly accessible.
No.
In fact, one of the reasons why I moved to Manchester was the fact that in Manchester we've got a tram network that covers the city, and 100% of the network is wheelchair accessible.
All right.
So Manchester is a lot easier to get around for me.
Yeah, I can imagine. Generally, in Paris, buses are pretty good with taking people with a
Yeah.
walking or a wheelchair if you want. If you take this what we've talked to about so far, are there countries that are ahead with other countries, and or could you give an example of a country that is really ahead with this, and countries that are really trailing behind?
With accessibility or inclusion in general, would you say?
No, no, I guess inclusion. I mean, accessibility could be part of inclusion.
Yeah, it is. I don't think the thing is, I think I would say there's not one country that's like, conquered it all, because we've got so many systemic inequalities, I think,
Mhm.
across loads and loads of countries. Of course, there are some countries that are, I would say, really behind in terms of inclusion and equality. In some countries,
Mhm.
it's illegal to be gay, for example, and you can
Yeah,
even
yeah.
face the death penalty. Um, you know, Whereas compared to some countries like the UK and Australia and Ireland that have now legalized gay marriage, for example. So um, there are. It's really a spectrum. Um, and even if you take a country like the US, for example, I think the US you would generally argue is maybe a bit more accessible for wheelchair users because it's a newer country,
Mhm.
historically
Mhm.
speaking, um, and and therefore accessibility is a bit more of a new phenomenon
Right.
compared to parts of the UK where you've got buildings that are still hundreds of years old that are very difficult to make accessible um, after the fact.
Yeah. Is it usually when you talk about these kind of sort of soft subjects? I mean it in the good sense of the word. Are countries like Sweden really ahead, or do you not know, or do you know?
It's really interesting actually, because if you look at the Nordics, on one level, they appear to be quite advanced when it comes to equality because
Mhm.
it's kind of embedded in their culture,
Yeah.
um, and um, um, it, so it's embedded. It's embedded in that equality is embedded in their culture. However, I've had some really interesting conversations recently with a an academic in Copenhagen
Mhm.
where where the countries are becoming more diverse, through immigration, for example, and there are differences, or we're starting to sort of see differences between people in society, that equality isn't actually creating fairness, because I suppose that they're coming at it from, well, we just need to treat everybody the same. However, that doesn't necessarily create a level playing field. What we need to be focusing on is creating equity, and equity is about understanding the individual, understanding what their strengths are, what their needs are, and giving them the tools and resources to be able to thrive. So treating everybody the same is, in terms of an equality perspective, doesn't necessarily level the playing field. We really should be focusing on equity.
Okay, interesting approach is that. Yeah, never thought about that. Yeah. I have a maybe a bit of a controversial question, and I got that from, again, your LinkedIn profile. So it does, again, this, it's all meant in the good sense of the question. So I wrote down here, where does it stop? Now we are at least in my mind, we were an LGBTQ plus. I read on your profile that you added an A and an I to that as well, right? Without,
Yeah.
what does that stand for to start with? Because that was a total new thing for me, A and I.
Yeah. So the I could be intersex. The A could be, so you got LGBTQIA is it's kind of the long form of it. You know, a lot of people will just say LGBT plus. The thing is, I think quite often we can get hung up on the language that's being used. Whether, you know, do we say LGBT? Do we say LGBTQ? Do we say LGBTQIA? I think what we need to do is take it back to some kind of basic principles around inclusion. And if we look at really the four pillars of inclusion are respect, empowerment, belonging, and progression. So if we take, if you are a member of the LGBT plus community within the world of work, do you feel respected for who you are? Do you, you know, if you want to bring your whole self to work, which is a phrase that's commonly used, do you work in an environment that you can do that, and you feel safe to do that?
Yeah.
Do you feel like you belong to the corporation? Do you feel like you're able to progress in your career? And are you empowered? So I think we need to, rather than get hung up on what letters or language we should be using, is focus more on the inclusivity side of things.
Right. And that's your opinion. I mean, that's your work, and that's how you approach this.
Yeah. So I tend to focus more on inclusivity, because the thing is, diversity is so vast and so broad. Within the UK, for example, we've got in our equality legislation, which is the Equality Act 2010, there are 9 protected characteristics. Thing is, I say to my clients that, you know, that's the bare minimum. You know, we need, because diversity is so broad. I mentioned earlier the difference between introverts and extroverts. You know, that's not protected under the equality legislation. But if you're an introvert, for example, and you work in a very extroverted team or an extroverted company, you might really struggle to progress in your career, because it's those that speak the loudest, that put themselves out there, might get promoted quicker than those who are, to borrow a phrase of one of my clients, quietly brilliant at what they do.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm reading this from my own perspective, evidently, and I'm wondering inside in my mind, I'm wondering, where does this stop? LGBTQAI plus. I mean, before you know it, we've got the whole alphabet there, and then if you're not part of any of that community, then I mean, you're stuck as well in a way, because I cannot say what I want, because then I'm offending any of this whole alphabet group. And I'm, in the end, I could feel excluded from everything else. So I'm on the flip side of everything.
Yeah, there's that risk, and I think this is the dilemma that we often get in, that when we do talk about diversity, again, everyone needs to be part of the conversation. If
Right.
let's put LGBTQ or whatever other letters you want to add
Yeah,
to
indeed.
one side, if we look at gender, for example, and gender equality within the workplace, um, what often happens is that an organization will say, okay, we're really worried because we've got this, gender imbalance. It could be that there are not many women at the top of the company, or we've got a department like engineering which doesn't have many women working in it because, it it's commonly known that like the science and technology and engineering sectors have got a gender imbalance challenge. What often happens is that gender imbalance becomes kind of the issue for the women working in that part of the business. Whereas actually, this is a conversation that we should all be having. Men should be part of the conversation about
Mhm.
gender balance and addressing gender equality, because quite often they are the ones in an organization holding the power and the privilege, and they need to exercise some of that to create more equality within the workplace.
Yeah,
Um,
I think all in all, still, it's we're still growing into this, right? It's still in
mm,
its in infancy, if that makes any sense, and it can also be a
yeah,
very controversial subject, I think, when you talk about
yeah.
it.
I mean, it's the number one. It's the number one thing. Like when I sit down with senior leaders in a business, and I say to them, what's preventing the progression of inclusion or diversity in your company, they will often say it comes down to fear.
Hmm.
I'm worried about saying the wrong thing, causing offense, causing embarrassment, um, and putting my foot in it, and therefore they they tend to retreat rather
Yeah,
than have brave conversations.
and that's what we should have, you think?
Yeah, we should be having braver conversations. And what I mean by brave conversations is and this is part of, I think, a part of being culturally aware, is moving outside of your comfort zone, and having those kind of difficult, awkward, tricky conversations, because that's when people feel seen and valued and heard. And from personal experience, having a disability, I've worked with loads of managers who they're worried about talking about disability, so they kind of try and brush it under the carpet rather than just putting it out there and having an open, honest conversation with one another.
Hmm. Yeah, food for thought, at least, and we're not at the end yet, I guess.
No, it's constantly work in progress. I don't think we'll ever quite get it right, because things are always evolving and adapting.
Yeah, in a shape of flux, indeed. All right, Toby.
Mm.
I usually tend to keep my interviews about around 30 minutes. We're at that mark now, at this moment. So
Sure.
I'm gonna ask you two more questions. And the first one that I prepped you for already is: can you give us 3 tips to become more culturally competent?
Yeah, I would say being flexible, adapting your own leadership style, way of working, to adapt to the person or the people that you're working with. I would say it's important to have a growth mindset. So always be open to learning new things, um, and kind of, yeah, being open to learning. And I would say the third one would be um, empathy, being empathic. So what I mean by that is trying to listen first, understand where somebody else is coming from, trying to understand their position without jumping to the answers or conclusions, or trying to think about the solutions before you've really understood where somebody's really coming from.
Yeah, makes good sense. Very good. Last question here. is, and by the way, your tips will be in the show notes that will be online on culturematters.com. My last question for you is, how can people get in touch with you?
The easiest thing to do is just connect with me on LinkedIn. I pick up messages on there. I also post a few times a week thought leadership pieces around diversity and inclusion, or you can just go to my website, which is mildon.co.uk.
Mildon, Mildon.
That's correct, yeah. mildon.co.uk.
All right. Got that down. That'll be in the show notes as well. So if people do want to get in touch with you and know more about the work that you do, or maybe need some assistance as well, they can do that through there. All right. Well,
Yeah,
it's been
happy to help.
Sure. It's been a pleasure talking to you. And it took some time for us to get together to find a time that actually would work in both time zones that we are. But we got it done.
Yeah.
And so I thank you so much, and really good luck with you with the work that you're doing.
You're welcome. Thanks, Chris. Thank you.
Thank you.